Good morning and welcome to the 7th meeting of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee. Our first item of business today is a decision to take items 3, 4 and 5 in private. Do we have agreement for that?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. And today we're going to be taking evidence from 2 further panels on refugee and asylum seekers. Given that this topic is also of interest to the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee, we have invited members of the committee to join today's session, and we welcome back Pam Gosal, MSP, to our meeting this week. And Pam's going to be joining us remotely. And I also welcome today to the meeting our first panel, who are all joining us remotely. And we have Graham O'Neill, who is the Policy Manager for the Scottish Refugee Council. Welcome. Andy Searle, Legal Director and Partner, and Lydia Danku from Just Citizens member from Just Right Scotland. Welcome to both of you. And we have apologies from Rubina Qureshi, who was going to be joining us, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Positive Action in Housing. So a few issues to point out before we get started. Please allow our broadcasting colleagues a moment to turn your microphone on before you start to speak. Witnesses can indicate they wish to speak by typing an R in the dialogue box, the chat function in blue jeans, or simply by showing your hand if we're not picking you up if you are having technical difficulties. And I would urge everybody to be mindful of time this morning because we do have quite a lot of business to get through. You don't have to answer every single question, but if you do have something that you need to add, please feel free to do so. And could I ask that members of the committee direct their question initially to a panel member? That would be very helpful. So I'm first going to turn to our first theme, and I'm going to hand over to Jeremy Balfour, MSP, who's going to kick us off. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for coming along to give evidence, and thank you also for your written evidence, which has been really helpful already. Can I start maybe with asking a question to Graham, if that's okay? In the previous Parliament, we did some work on the dispersion of refugees, asylum seekers across the whole of Scotland, and there were obviously issues around some of that in regard to housing, and particularly in regard to perhaps legal advice that you can get out with the Central Belt. As a principle, do you think it's a good idea that individuals aren't just placed in maybe Glasgow, Lanarkshire or Edinburgh, but they are found accommodation and support in other parts of Scotland as well? And if so, how do we go about doing that in a more effective way? Sorry, Graham.
Thanks very much, Jeremy, and thank you to the committee for inviting us to come and give evidence today. Yeah, it's a very pertinent question, Jeremy, and I would say that in principle, the Scottish Refugee Council, and indeed I think the wider refugee sector across the UK, is for people being housed in communities, in normal accommodation, residential accommodation, like what I'm sitting in just now, as opposed to being placed into often hotel room isolation, or worse still, military barracks, which is not appropriate for anybody, and that very much includes people seeking refugee protection who have often fled war and persecution and often have complex psychological trauma because of repeated episodes of very severe impacts and events. So, we've had what, in terms of the jargon, is called a dispersal system for about 20 years. Glasgow's been the biggest in the UK over that 20-year period. Currently has about 6,000 people seeking asylum who are housed in the city. And yeah, what we want to see in relation to the housing of people seeking asylum is that people are housed in communities, that local authorities and local health services and local charities are supported, including directly funded by the Home Office, to do what they want to do best, which is to welcome and integrate those that are here seeking safety at a kind of very difficult point in their lives, from countries like Afghanistan and Syria and Eritrea, and for reasons known to the Home Office, most of all, they've persistently refused to provide direct funding to local authorities and health services, and that's problematic because often there's a number of reasons, but one of the first reasons I would give is that often people are accommodated by outsourcing private companies like Serco or G4S or Mears Group or Clear Springs in some of the poorest areas of the country. Often it's those areas that are the ones that welcome people most warmly, but the housing is often not of good quality, has structural issues which go back many decades, and these areas are classed as areas of multiple deprivation, so they've already got a lot of challenges. And of course, there's been significant cuts in central government grants, the UK central government grants to local authorities over a number of years. So putting all that into the mix, it's very difficult ask of local authorities unless there is direct funding and they have a say in where people can be placed, and so that it rubs up well with their local housing policies and their local community planning policies. So the movement of people through the dispersal programme into wider set of local authority areas, including in Scotland, beyond Glasgow, is something in principle we very much welcome and have called for consistently for a generation, really. But there needs to be certain things in place, direct funding to the local areas from the Home Office, and also it's done on a partnership basis. The problem at the moment is that the Home Office have been rolling out what they call contingency accommodation for the last 2.5 years. So there was and that is generally people being placed in hotels, often for very long periods of time, months, or sometimes close to a year. And that's very expensive for the UK state to be paying that amount of money. And the numbers are quite stark in terms of the increase. So there's about 1,000 to 1,500 people in October 2019 who were placed across the UK in hotel-type accommodation, which is inappropriate. It's people experience often as institutional accommodation. They have £1 a day to get by on, no real choice over the food they have, aren't allowed to work by the system, and often are placed there without any consultation of the local authority and health services, who are then having to play catch-up, which is not right. It doesn't need to be like this. But increasingly it is like that. So now we've got just shy of 30,000, we estimate, people who are in such contingency institutional accommodation across the UK, including close to 500 people in Scotland, across 7, from what we can see, 6 to 7 local authorities. And that has been done, what we described in our written evidence, through a fait accompli practice, that people have been moved into these areas with no consultation with the local authority or health services. And we question whether this is actually contingency accommodation, because the length of stay that people are in it is quite significant. And as I touched on just a minute ago, the costs are really, really eye-watering, actually, and in our view, wasteful, and it could be done so much better. So what the Home Secretary gave evidence to the Home Affairs Committee last Wednesday in the UK Parliament, and she confirmed, and the Home Office later clarified, that currently £3.5 million is being paid per day to accommodate, at that point, 25,000 people, asylum seekers, in so-called contingency, generally ex-hotel accommodation barracks. When you just do a simple sum on that, multiply that £3.5 million by 365, you come to £1.277 billion is being spent by the Home Office to private companies, so that is Mears, Serco or Clear Springs, in terms of their accommodation contractors, who then contract with hoteliers. I don't blame the hoteliers for taking those contracts, because many of them have lost their market through the COVID crisis. But when you think about what that figure is, that is a gross waste of public monies, which even a fraction of that, if it was diverted into local authorities, would enable them to identify areas and then be able to place people, going back to my first point, in communities where they can live their lives and be the normal people that people are, just the extraordinary challenges in their life. And just to give you, kind of zooming out from that 1.277 billion figure, that's been spent in relation to 1/3 of the current asylum seeker population. There's 80,000 people in asylum accommodation across the UK, so about 25 to 30,000 are being placed into anyway inappropriate accommodation because it's ex-hotels. It's not right for people. It's traumatising for many people and isolating. But then that 1.277 billion constitutes over a quarter of the £4 billion that was budgeted by the Home Office and the Treasury for these 10-year contracts. So just putting it all together, as you all will know better than I, this is dysfunctional, it's wasteful, it doesn't need to be like this, and it's not sustainable. And nobody's actually winning out of this in terms of the people placed in the accommodation, because it's really damaging for them, especially longer people are in there. But also for the Home Office and the Treasury, I would imagine the Treasury must be looking at this and thinking, what on earth is going on here? This cannot be allowed to happen. Now, the Home Secretary was the first Home Secretary last Wednesday to actually say in the Home Affairs Committee for the best part of a decade that they are now going to directly fund local authorities. And it's really important that that promise is made good on quickly across the UK, including in relation to Scotland and Glasgow and other local authority areas. Because that's the solution here, is that you work with local authorities in partnership, provide direct funding, rather than this distribution of resources to huge private companies, and then they contract with hoteliers. And the costs, as I've just outlined, are really unsustainable and actually quite wasteful. And the profits that are being made by the private companies, that is specifically the accommodation contractors, are unsurprisingly there to see. So in year 2020, Clear Springs Ready Home, who cover much of the London and south east of England, they were making £4.4 million profit. The three directors share the dividend of £7 million between them. That's £2.3 million each.
Graham, sorry to...
That's the company that runs
Napier.
The profits were also made by Serco and Mears Group as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry to interrupt there, but I know that Jeremy does have another question. We only have till 9:55, and we've got quite a lot of questions to get through. Jeremy?
Yeah, that's helpful background, Graham. If I can just direct this question back to you, and maybe with a slightly briefer answer. If this policy is carried out, as was announced by the Home Secretary last week, is there enough appropriate housing in places like Glasgow and Edinburgh and other parts of Scotland to accommodate these individuals? So do we have enough accommodation? I know Edinburgh struggles often to give any support because they don't have the accommodation, but across Scotland, do we have that accommodation, or are we going to have to see more new builds and other properties coming onto the market?
Yeah, I promised to be brief for this time, and thank you for your forbearance earlier. Yeah, I mean, it'd be better for Edinburgh and Glasgow to be a much better place than I to answer that, but certainly what we've picked up is there are acute housing pressures in some parts of Scotland, and within that, the housing markets are quite tight. But what I would say is that there's this discussion's never really been allowed to happen across different Scottish local authorities between the Home Office and them around how do we identify appropriate accommodation. So what is the accommodation city in Aberdeen City or in Stirling or in Dundee as well? And that's the discussion that we really need to happen. And that discussion can happen if there is a serious discussion around direct funding and a partnership approach being taken. Because, people at Glasgow, Susan Aitken, to her credit, said this last week, and we fully agree, as people coming from all parts of the world to Glasgow has been a really positive thing over the last 20 years for Glasgow. We've seen the difference it's made in terms of education for, some schools, just in terms of the language diversity within many schools in Glasgow has been really enriching for that and has had a positive educational impact in the wider school community where you have asylum seeker children, for want of a better way of putting it there. So it's possible, and the only way that discussion can happen is if, as we hope, the Home Secretary was being genuine and on it in terms of saying that direct funding can now happen. Because otherwise what we would have is what I outlined earlier, which is just people getting shunted into inappropriate ex-hotel accommodation and feeling really isolated, well-meaning people across the country doing the best they can, but with no funding behind them. And it shouldn't be like this. It doesn't need to be like this. I suppose is the kind of point I'm making is we just need a partnership between central and local government here, and then plan out to put people into communities. So the housing could well be available, but we need to get the discussions going first, and they're blocked at the moment because of, in our experience, the Home Office just digging their heels in and pumping all the money to kind of shadow state private companies. It doesn't need to be like that. You know, that's not a serious levelling up agenda. That's not a serious agenda in terms of, you know, respecting devolution. But we need to get to that point, and then we can start to hopefully open up the housing that might just be sitting dormant within other local authority areas within Scotland.
Thank you very much for your answer, Graham. We're going to move on to our next theme, which is no recourse to public funds. I have a number of members who want to come in on this. We've got Pam Duncan-Glancy first, then Miles Briggs would like to come in, and then Emma Roddick, who's joining us remotely. Pam?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the panel. Thank you for joining us, and thank you also for the information you've given us in advance. It's really helpful. I want to just start with exploring a little bit about no recourse to public funds and how we can use mechanisms in the third sector and others to support people. And specifically, Just Right, in your submission, you noted the importance of making sure that people get the right information about what they can access and what they can't access, and a bit of there was a difference, and some people assumed certain funds were unavailable or were listed for purposes that meant they couldn't access it. So could you tell us a little bit about the importance of that, and how could we fix it? What could we do to make sure people do get the information that they need? Thanks. Oh, sorry. Could I direct it to Lydia and Andy, please?
Thanks. Can I just let Andy answer that, please?
Hi, good morning. Thanks very much, Pam, for the question. The issue of no recourse to public funds is vexing, and it has been deeply problematic for a very, very long time. One of the reasons why it's so complex and difficult for professionals, services and individuals themselves to understand is because it's a very fluid thing. We have this idea in our head where there's no recourse to public funds, and everybody knows what that means, and it's a static thing. But that's not the reality that we live in. Because of the hostile environment, it's very easy for somebody to become no recourse to public funds. But there are also avenues out of it. So no recourse to public funds is either a condition on leave to remain, or it's a result of being undocumented. And becoming undocumented is something that's actually, because of the hostile environment, easy to do. You know, Home Office decision making is erratic. Administration errors are made at the Home Office. Some families can't afford to pay fees for applications. Women fleeing domestic violence can become no recourse to public funds. European nationals with pre-settled status can have blockages to public funds because of whether they're working or not, whether they're exercising treaty rights. So whether you have a job or not can determine whether you're NRPF. So it's very difficult to gather the data, and understanding the nuances of this is a challenge for services. I completely understand this. Immigration law is extremely complex, and it's hard to convey it in simple terms when actually something can be so fact specific. what I think the key things we need to make sure are widely understood are what are public funds in the immigration context and what's not. That is a key issue that we see time and time again that leads to gatekeeping with services. I remember delivering training a number of years ago to an educational institution that had been refusing educational funding for years to people on the basis of no recourse to public funds, despite the fact that educational funding is not a public fund. So there can be baked in misunderstandings around that. And I think that making it very clear that public funds is a list, and if it isn't on the list, it isn't a public fund, is quite an important element. And connected with that would be an important round of information dissemination or training. I mean, these things aren't enough. We already have the COSLA guidance, which is very good. There was training run off the back of that, which was successful. But, you know, people move on from jobs. Training only lasts as long as the people who are trained are in the job. We need to make sure that a response, a humane and well-informed response, no recourse to public funds, becomes a cultural reaction within services in Scotland, much like child safeguarding services are instinctive. I think a clear understanding of what NRPF is and a reasoned, fact-specific assessment at the time of people in front of those services is critical. And the last thing I'd say is making sure that services understand who to refer to. Because one really important thing about no recourse to public funds is that it can be very often remedied. You know, if you have a mother and child in front of you who are NRPF, they've got leave to remain, but they're NRPF and they're destitute. If they refer to an immigration lawyer as early as possible, it's very likely an immigration lawyer can apply to the Home Office to have that condition removed. Sometimes it can be quick, sometimes it can be slow because of the specific circumstances, but immigration lawyers are well placed to work as quickly as they can in order to make that happen. The earlier referral is made and the more work that is done to remedy the NRPF, then the less time the individuals are being supported using statutory powers when in fact state benefits can equally support them. So I think there's a combination of things there that need to happen, and they need to happen now, because as we'll speak about within a few moments, I'm sure the Nationality and Borders Bill is about to explode this problem on a scale that we've never seen before.
Lydia would like to come in on this quickly. Thanks, Lydia.
Many thanks. I just wanted to add a little bit to what Andy had alluded to about the impact of NRPF conditions, which continue to be felt disproportionately by women and disabled migrants because of their experiencing inequalities in an intersecting way, and therefore are more likely to need to access publicly funded support services. In particular, migrant women experiencing domestic violence who are potentially being forced to remain with a perpetrator, as they do not necessarily have access to publicly funded services and refuges. Thank you.
Back to Pam, thanks.
Thank you both for that. I found it really, really helpful. Thank you. Could you also talk about a bit about the touch points that people have with the system? Is it public sector? Is it housing? Is it health? Is it third sector? Is it all of the above? So that I can get a sense of where we need to ensure that knowledge exists and what kind of network needs to be created. And also, I know that there's been approximately about £1 million cut to third sector budgets in this budget. Do you know anything about the impact that will have on your sector to continue to provide support for people who have no recourse to public funds? And again, if that could be directed to Lydia and Andy. Thanks.
Thanks for the question. So in terms of your first question around touch points, it's hard to say. When I think about the referrals we receive through to Just Right Scotland, they come from a very, very wide variety of places. They come from local authorities. We run, for example, a second-tier immigration advice line on a Wednesday afternoon that usually gets at least 2 or 3 calls a week from local authorities, health visitors, social workers, criminal justice workers, coming up against the no recourse to public funds phenomenon and wondering what they can do effectively. So we receive referrals from directly from statutory services. So that's probably one of the first touch points. I think a lot of people, if they're at the stage where they're engaging with statutory services, don't want to say they're lucky, but they're in a more fortunate position than the ones that we don't know about. We work very closely with the British Red Cross, with Scottish Refugee Council, with Maryhill Integration Network, Governing Community Project, organisations on the ground that are really, in the trenches here. And I think those are the key touch points. And I think your second panel will definitely be able to speak to this. Those are key touch points that refer through to ourselves as well. And when they're working with individuals who are NRPF, it can be very difficult to get those individuals in front of statutory services for various reasons relating to fear. If you're undocumented, lots of individuals have a fear of engaging with the statutory services, as well as health, etc., etc. So those are kind of the key touch points we see. Sometimes we receive referrals through from police, Trafficking Awareness Raising Alliance, Scottish Guardianship Service is a huge referrer. But like I say, those are just the ones we see. We know that there are more out there, and it's difficult to reach them.
Thank you very much for your answer, Andy. Pam, is that you?
Thank you. Lydia, did you want to add anything to that?
Just in relation to, as related to employment impacts of COVID-19, such as statutory sick pay, furlough scheme, and the self-employment income support scheme, which have not been accessible to all migrants with NRPF conditions unless they have a work visa. And given the impact of COVID-19 on the labour market and the significant increases in the numbers of either lost or have had their incomes reduced, without access to the welfare system, NRPF migrants are a lot more likely to experience destitution.
Thank you very much for that, Lydia. I think that's very helpful for us to understand that. And we only have about 25 minutes left and a lot of questions to get through. So I'm going to ask both members and panel members if they can be really succinct, because there are still many areas that we would like to touch on. So I'm going to bring in Miles Briggs and then Emma Roddick and Faisal Chowdhury, who have questions on no recourse to public funds. Over to you, Miles. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the panel. I wanted to ask a question with regards to the Scottish Crisis Fund and how you think that's made a difference, and how, just for the interest of time, I'll maybe merge my second question, where in Scotland specifically, when you look at pressured areas like Glasgow City Council and Edinburgh City Council, where that's made a difference and how that's been administered. So I know, Andy, you touched upon the British Red Cross in your response, so I'll maybe bring you in, and if anyone else wants to comment, could they put an R in the chat, and I'll hand back to you, Convener. Thanks.
Thanks very much for the question. I think for the sake of brevity, I will defer because it's organisations like the Red Cross and the Refugee Council that are more likely to come in contact with the Scottish Crisis Fund. So I don't know whether Graham has anything to come in on, but if he doesn't, then Phil Arnold in the second panel will be able to speak to that.
Graham, would you like to come in and say something on that? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, I would say that Phil Arnold is the best person to talk on that. We do see pressures on those that we work with, particularly people that have been granted refugee status, who then fall into destitution almost perversely because they can't get access to the housing and access to universal credit and the social security system as quickly as they would hope to, and then have to try and draw upon emergency short-term payments, such as the crisis fund, and there can be difficulties sometimes in that. But I caveat that by saying, that it's our services colleagues that see this more acutely than I certainly do. So I wouldn't want to kind of speak too definitively on it. But it's certainly something that I know has been an issue. As I'm sure we'll touch upon later on, and as Andy mentioned, the issue around precarious lives and destitution is going to probably explode across parts of the UK, including Scotland, as a result of the Nationality and Borders Bill. So it's just to kind of take the opportunity very briefly to echo that. But I think Phil would be the best person to answer that in most detail. Sorry.
Thanks very much for that, Graham. And it's good to recognise that we do have British Red Cross coming in the second panel, who will be helpful there. Emma Roddick, who's remote, thanks, and then Faisal Chowdhury.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, everyone. This is really for Lydia, as it's a bit of an extension on what you were saying earlier. We know that migrant women are much more likely to be subject to domestic abuse, yet the NRPF policy prevents them from accessing support services. So given the high levels of destitution amongst these women, do you agree that supporting them needs to be the priority in terms of ending destitution, and who in your view is best placed to provide that support? And just for speed as well, I'll ask, does having NRPF make you even more vulnerable to further abuse?
Lydia?
Thank you. I think, yes, NRPF does make you more vulnerable. It creates a condition in which you are exactly an equal member of society, I would say, not being able to access the same services and to have the same protection. Yes, ending destitution would help, but removing NRPF conditions would probably put people on a level field.
Thank you very much, Lydia. Emma, is that you finished, or do you have a further question?
Those were my questions, thanks.
That's great, thanks very much for that. Over to Faisal Chowdhury, who is also remote.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I'll make it small as well. What is the impact of the known lack of data on people with NRPF, particularly on the third sector? And just for the time, I'll add the second question here as well. I mean, how would panel assess the role of the third sector in cities with large number of people with NRPF, given COSLA has highlighted the financial pressure, particularly on those cities?
And who would you like to direct that to, Faisal?
Whoever feels comfortable with. Andy?
Okay. Thank you very much for the question. Before I try and answer briefly your questions, I just want to say one thing in addition to the previous question from Emma around domestic violence and the impact on women, and because this is critical, and it's critical because it will, as a problem, it's going to amplify again after the Nationality and Borders Bill. In terms of who can support the survivors of domestic violence, local authorities can, under their existing statutory powers. We see them use Section 22 of the Children's Scotland Act to support women who have children who are fleeing abuse on our NRPF. Where there's a gap is women who don't have children. There is a power there in Section 12 of the Social Work Scotland Act 1968, but in our view, it's underused, and we need to develop our understanding of how we can provide safeguarding support in those circumstances. The second thing I briefly want to say about that is that shelters, women's aid shelters, etc., my understanding is that they're funded by housing benefit. And as a result, NRPF women are unable to access it. And there are some exceptions to that. But that seems to me to be an issue that requires to be looked at and is perhaps within the gift of the Scottish Parliament to do that. And does NRPF make women even more vulnerable to domestic violence? Yes, for sure. It's a means of coercive control from an abuser, but most importantly, it's state-perpetrated economic abuse. That's what it is. In terms of those second two questions, I'll be very brief. Impact of the lack of data on NRPF. I mean, I'll let COSLA and the local authorities speak to this more broadly, and I'm sure they did at the last session, but the figures I've seen in the briefing, around 9,000 in Scotland, seem to me very, very low. Very low indeed. And when we now have a population of about 300,000 Europeans who are in this post-Brexit era, where if you have pre-settled status, you can have no recourse to public funds or struggle to access benefits because of the assessment of your right to reside, it means people can flip in and out of NRPF. So that number, I think, is low. And if you don't have the correct numbers, then I don't see how you can resource the issue. And in terms of how can third sector assist statutory services in this, there are an amazing amount of things the third sector can do. The third sector, I'm thinking about grassroots organisations and larger services like Red Cross and SRC, are really struggling with capacity at this point in time across the sector. And so direct funding and resource has to be given there if there's any wish for the third sector to provide added value there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Andy. Thank you, Faisal. We're going to move on to questions from Natalie Dawn, who is remote as well, who's going to ask some questions on the Afghan resettlement scheme. Natalie?
Thanks, convener, and good morning, panel. I'm going to direct my question to Graham, and I want to thank you for your very thorough response in your first comments. They were really very helpful. I originally had some questions around contingency accommodation, but you've answered those. So I'd like to ask, what is your assessment of why asylum decisions take so long, and what do you think can be done to address the backlog that's the result of that? And equally, what impact do you think that has on those waiting for those decisions?
Over to you, Graham.
Thanks, Natalie. Thank you. Thanks, Natalie, for the question. Yeah, I mean, the asylum system, insofar as the asylum system is broken, which is one of the kind of assertions that's put forward by the current Home Secretary, we think it's squarely within the Home Secretary and the Home Office's responsibility. There's two major problems. The first is you've spoken to, that is actually the pivotal one, which is the long-term trend that's been around since 2014, the slow asylum decision-making process. And that currently means that we have 83,000 people who are still awaiting just an initial asylum decision, 56,000 who have been waiting 6 months or more, and 23,000 who have been waiting 18 months or more just to find out an initial asylum decision. The pattern of nationalities that apply for asylum is pretty standard and conventional in UK terms. Now, by that I mean it's quite regular. There's a kind of pattern to it and many of the people that do, at least half that do come, are on UK refugee recognition terms. From high refugee recognition countries, from Afghanistan, Iran, Sudan, Vietnam, Eritrea, Syria, Yemen, etc. 70% are above refugee recognition rate. And the reason I highlight that is that given that there's such a substantial number of people who are from, over a long period of time, high refugee recognition countries in UK terms, you would think logically that there would be consideration getting given, especially as there's a bulging backlog now of people literally stuck in the asylum decision-making process, that there would be some innovations coming forward. The UNHCR themselves have touched on with the Home Office last year, most recently, to think about, a simplified procedure towards grants of refugee leave for people from high refugee recognition countries with it's very important, there can be no removal of safeguards from such individuals, but just try to kind of like maintain the quality but speed up the system in a way which grants people leave who anyway are ultimately going to be given refugee leave in the current system, kind of pre-nationality and borders bill that is. And but that there's a kind of head in the sand mentality that's just not been there. And these trends of chronic slowness in asylum decisions predate COVID. They're already there. And the number of asylum applications over this period is fairly stable. So it's not so that the reasons for the backlog are not to do with huge numbers, huge increases in asylum applications, and actually, almost perversely, initial decisions on asylum applications have fell by 40% over the last 5 years. So there's something quite irresponsible going on, I suppose, is what we are saying here, and how the Home Office are mismanaging the asylum decision process. Now, you correctly asked about the impact of this. Notice I touched upon part of the impact, because the flip side of slowness in the asylum decisions is people being stuck in increasingly inappropriate and actually eye-wateringly expensive inappropriate accommodation, contingency accommodation, some of the figures I was mentioning, for long periods of time. So if you speed up the asylum decision-making process, people are not going to be stuck in hotel room isolation or barracks, or they'll be able to do what any person wants to do, which is to get on with their lives, contribute, work, be part of the community. That's what people want to do. So Andy mentioned, that there's very high levels of poverty that kind of flow out from the no recourse to public funds system, and the asylum support system. I would put inverted commas around support, because we actually look at what people get in terms of financial support. Remember, they're not allowed to work by the Home Office, which is in itself a irresponsible and perverse decision. It amounts to about 40 to 42% the value below the social security minimum in terms of financial support. That's if you're in community dispersal accommodation. If you're in hotels, you get £1 a day, £8 a week. That's it. I mean, it wouldn't even buy you a fish supper in most Scottish towns and cities. It's obscene. So it's UK state-sanctioned, severest forms of poverty imaginable, and it has an impact on people. And if one empathises and imagines what that does to people, not over a few weeks, because that's not what we're talking about here, but over years, because of the chronic slowness in asylum decisions, people lose hope. Poverty starts to eat away at people, starts to increase mental health pressures and deteriorations. And I keep going back to this original point, it really doesn't need to be like this. If we had a better functioning asylum decision-making system that was able to make swift grants of refugee leave for those who are anyway from high refugee recognition countries, and then the costs that are then displaced not onto the people themselves in terms of mental health harm as poverty it's in, but also just to reiterate that the kind of eye-watering costs that are then getting displaced to the private interests, accommodation companies, and also the hoteliers, who we don't blame. The hoteliers, they say, have got their job to do. They've lost their markets in many ways. It's a really dysfunctional, incompetent way. So it really grates with us when we hear the Home Secretary consistently say, when putting forward the UK Nationality Borders Bill, the system is broken. If one done a problem analysis of the asylum system, we'd say, sort out the chronic slowness in asylum decisions, sort out the prohibitive and inappropriate, the prohibitive costs and inappropriate accommodation that's been provided as well, and then don't introduce the Nationality and Borders Bill, or at the very least take the asylum and criminalisation, because they are just going to make it worse. Graham. And they're, in fact, through inadmissibility, they already are.
Graham, we're actually going to move on to that topic at the moment. I mean, I really want to try and fit it in. Thanks very much. So we do have some questions round about the Nationality and Borders Bill and the Legislative Consent Memorandum. So I'm going to bring Marie in on that, and then we'll hand over to Pam Duncan-Glancy after that. So Marie McNair, who joins us remotely, if you could come in now, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. Put this question to Graham. The Scottish Refugee Council has referred to the Nationality and Borders Bill as an anti-refugee bill and argued it's the biggest threat to refugee rights in decades. You've also provided us with significant written evidence about the bill in the legislative consent memorandum. To also ensure there's oral evidence on record, would you mind giving us a summary of your main concerns about the Nationality and Borders Bill? Thanks, Graham.
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, I mean, we have the gravest concerns about the Nationality and Borders Bill. Those of us that work in the immigration and asylum field, are kind of like almost assaulted with immigration and asylum legislation every few years. It's heavily legislated, and therefore there's a lot of instability that kind of stems out of that for people trying to make sense of the law and policy in immigration and asylum. I say that by way of very brief context because the Nationality and Borders Bill is different. It is truly a new nadir in UK refugee law and policy. It is a policy, and that is a new plan for immigration and legislation, that is a Nationality Borders Bill, that severs the UK state's link with the Refugee Convention itself. Now, the Refugee Convention flowed out of the international community's revulsion at the horrors of the Holocaust. That's where it came from, and it came from a resoluteness within the international community immediately after the Second World War to say we can't have displaced peoples, as at that point was happening across Europe, not being able to actually get into countries to seek safety and refuge. We need to do something. We need to create a right for people, if they meet certain criteria, to be able to get refuge. Now, what the Nationality and Borders Bill is to say severs the links, or as UNHCR says, it renders it's incompatible with the UN Refugee Convention. And it does that because the UN Refugee Convention, it provides that right of seeking safety within a territory. And it also provides a protection for people who do that, who not to be subject to criminal administrative penalties for seeking safety in a territory. So somebody coming to the UK by boat, or have been dropped off in a lorry in a car park. It's that person should not be subject to criminal administrative penalties by dint of the fact, the manner in which they've arrived. Because by its nature, people who are seeking refugee protection can't get a travel document or a visa from the states, the oppressive regimes that they're fleeing. Like somebody from the Taliban somebody's not going to go to the Taliban and say, can I get a document so that I can flee away from you? And the Refugee Convention recognised that, and therefore treats with equanimity irregular arrival without documents in the same way that it would with people who are arriving legally and with documents. And that's a really important recognition which is built into the Refugee Convention, and that is one of the ones that's enabled millions of people over 70 years to seek safety and to be safe and to rebuild their lives, including relatively small numbers in the UK compared to the world globally in terms of refugee movements. But the Nationality and Borders Bill reverses that principle, so it doesn't treat with equanimity irregular arrival, necessarily so, from people seeking safety. It will actually punishes people for arriving irregularly. And that's why we describe it as a severing of the link with it, because in the UNHCR say it's incompatible, because you can't have it both ways. If you recognise in treat with equanimity irregular arrival there and not to subject people to criminal administrative penalties, then you're complying with the Refugee Convention. If you don't do that, as this Nationality and Borders Bill, then what you're actually doing, as the bill says, is that you're replacing the current refugee protection policy in the UK with something different. We think it's been replaced by a refugee punishment system, a refugee punishment regime. So if somebody from Afghanistan was to arrive once this bill becomes an act later on this year and seeks safety, and arrives necessarily irregularly because they don't have the travel documents, they just had to get away, then that person will be immediately subject to a set of interlocking penalties. That's why we describe it as a penalty and a punishment regime. Immediately they'll be liable to the criminal offence of unlawful arrival, 12 months minimum or 40 years in prison. That's somebody fleeing the Taliban. It could be a woman fleeing the Taliban. They will be almost certainly placed into an accommodation centre, isolated, probably getting £8 a week, as I was describing earlier. They will not have any consideration for the first number of months of their substantive protection claim, whereas the Home Office will then look to see how they can either remove that person through some, thankfully they're not in place yet, offshoring arrangement, or have a readmission agreement that encompasses third country nationals to some distant states. Thankfully, they don't have any of that at the moment either. And they won't have any prospect of refugee leave, 5 years limited leave, and then to move on to settlement. If they cannot be removed by the Home Office, then the Home Office will then maybe grudgingly give the person what is called temporary protection status, which is up to 2.5 years temporary protection, which may well be subject to an NRPF condition on it, increasing the risk of destitution. And they will not have any notable rights from what we can see in relation to family reunion either. So there's a set of interlocking penalties visited upon somebody who necessarily arrives irregularly to the UK as a result of this bill, and the people that will be subject to that are people who are seeking refugees. So we're very much of the view.
Sorry, I know that Marie has a further question and Andy wants to come in on it. So Marie, could you ask your further question? And thank you. Marie.
Thank you, Convener. And thanks, Graham, for that very comprehensive response. There's significant issues, to say the least, with this bill. Do any other members wish to add on that? Obviously, I know that Andy wants to come in. I know we're kind of pushed for time, but it's a really important issue. Thank you.
Andy?
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. It's a really important point. I was just wanting to take Graham's comments and put them in context for what it's going to mean for individuals living in Scotland, and perhaps what we can do about it, and what the committee can recommend to colleagues and the Parliament. Just following on from what Graham was saying, I'm just going to read out a quote from the United Nations on this bill. And it's really important that we understand this. The quote says, in short, Group 2 status, that's the status, the new refugee status that Graham was talking about, is not only inconsistent with the Refugee Convention, it is also a recipe for mental and physical ill health, social and economic marginalisation and exploitation. The human cost to the refugees and their families, including their children, is obvious enough and deliberate. Because by definition, refugees cannot go home, the economic and social costs of their immiseration will ultimately be borne by local authorities, communities, and the National Health Service. That is a quote from the United Nations, who do not enter the foray of domestic politics lightly. And I think that really hits home what we're talking about here in terms of those broad reserved powers that are being implemented on individuals in Scotland and what's going to happen. One or two other things I just wanted to touch on that's really important. Protection standards within the bill. The law itself is being rewritten in this bill in order to reduce the prospects of obtaining protection for key groups like women and children, particularly women fleeing gender-based violence. Age assessment. There's lots in this bill about age assessment, which reaches a very long arm into child law in Scotland. Scottish local authorities are going to be compelled by the Home Office to conduct age assessments on children and young people, or pass it on to a new National Age Assessment Board. Their decisions will be binding on Scottish local authorities. Decisions that are made for immigration purposes, binding on children's services here to determine the eligibility of child protection services in Scotland. Scientific methods, which have been long debunked as junk science, and you will struggle to find a scientist in the UK in support of this, certainly all the regulatory bodies are dead against it, are in this bill. And the last thing I'll say is human trafficking and exploitation. The measures that are being put forward in this bill are very regressive. They penalise the late disclosure, or rather not immediate disclosure of deeply traumatising incidents. And anyone who works with survivors of trauma know that traumatic disclosure happens over a period of time. You can't do that anymore off the back of this bill. And that applies to men, women, and children in Scotland. This bill in terms of trafficking for people in Scotland, and trafficking is a devolved issue, is going after victims. It's looking and trying to go after victims and reduce the number of people who are recognised as victims. Well, guess what? When you have less victims recognised, you're going to have even fewer prosecutions. This is going to inhibit Scottish criminal justice system going after traffickers as well. So really no one wins. And I know that those two, age assessment and trafficking, are part of the LCM, and I just want to put on record our views on that in addition to our written evidence.
Thank you very much for that, Andy. That's very helpful. Pam, do you have a few questions, Pam Duncan-Glancy, on this issue?
Thank you, Convener, and I'll be brief. Thank you for setting that out, Andy. And also, just to put on record, the quote from the United Nations is stark, and this really is a new low for us, I think, this bill, and I hope that it doesn't pass. Could you briefly, possibly, Andy, if that's all right, set out what we can do in Scotland in terms of ensuring that access to support that is available, or that now needs to be available as a result of the bill if it were to pass? What can we do in Scotland through councils or government here to try and protect people?
Thank you for the question, Pam. I'm looking in the remote chat here, and I think Graham is lined up to answer this question. He was desperate to answer it. So it's good that you asked it. So I'll pass over to Graham for that.
Okay, Graham, yep. And if you can be very brief, because we do have a few questions left and we're over time. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll do it first and be brief. The first of the 5 things we want to see happen is the legislative consent motion to be approved by the Scottish Parliament, so that the consent will be withheld in relation to the trauma notices, and also the trafficking information notices and the age assessment. The second, we would like to see the institution of a Scottish identification responsibility in relation to human trafficking and exploitation. So the use of the Section 9 powers in the 2015 legislation up here, so that we have an end-to-end human trafficking and exploitation protection process that makes initial decisions on trafficking status, and then provides support and assistance which is already in that 2015 legislation, and then crucially about whether somebody's to be recognised as a survivor of trafficked exploitation, with any recommendations that body would then make to the Home Secretary for leave to remain would be a logical thing. Really needed now, because the bill is going to really affect trafficking, exploitation, survivors' rights. The third is we want consideration to be given to a positive duty within a Scottish Human Rights Act to refugee migrant inclusion, so that Scottish public authorities see the refugee and see the migrant in their standard work, because the point of this Nationality and Borders Bill is not to see the refugee, is to reclassify the refugee in that really horrible term, illegal migrant, illegal immigrant, and remove all their rights and indeed criminalise them. So it's really important that a Scottish Human Rights Act does that. The fourth is we want to see the Lord Advocate produce clear human rights-based guidance or instructions to prosecutors that it is generally not in the public interest to prosecute what we would regard as refugees for this new unlawful arrival offence. That is a critical safeguard, the public interest test that sits with the Lord Advocate, against the kind of absurdity and the perversity of, for example, people fleeing Syria or Iran or Afghanistan being criminalised through the Scottish criminal justice process for the unlawful arrival offence within this bill. And the fifth is we think it's imperative that the Scottish Government conduct a review of its key national policies, which is listed in our written evidence, including the human trafficking exploitation strategy, including the Ending Destitution Together strategy and New Scottish refugee integration, in the light of this bill, because, as Andy rightly said earlier on, amongst other things, destitution is going to explode as a result of this bill if it's implemented. So the Scottish Government must review those strategies, strengthen them, and we think adequately resource them. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Graham. We have a final 2 questions. We have one from Jeremy Balfour and another from Pam Gossel from the Equalities Committee, who joins us remotely. Jeremy.
Thank you. 2 quick questions. The first one, it may be more helpful if you could put this in writing back to us, because it is quite a long answer. We've talked about the Afghan resettlement. My understanding was that if we look back slightly to the work that was done by Scottish Government, UK Government and local authorities and the third sector around the Syrian refugees that came in, that was very successful. And I'm just wondering if you could respond to us to see what lessons have we learned from that and how do we implement that going forward. And then a question of clarification. There seems to be some confusion in regard to children who are either refugees or asylum seekers being allowed to have bus passes under the new scheme. And I wonder, do you have any information? Is that available to children across Scotland who have this status at the moment, or is it not? Does anyone have any information on that?
Okay, so if I could ask if the first question, which will require a detailed answer, I think if we can get some of that in writing, that would be fantastic. And if anybody has anything to add about the under-22s bus. I'm not sure if any... Andy, I can see that you've got your hand up. Yeah.
We're happy to put something in writing in respect of the Afghan resettlement scheme. The lessons we learned from the Syrian resettlement scheme is that information around rights and entitlements is absolutely critical from an immigration perspective for those who have arrived. The 2 key elements are refugee family reunion. Families who have been resettled are often portions of families. Their brothers, sisters, parents, sometimes even older children are very often left behind or scattered in the region. And understandably, the first thing on their mind is to try and see them again. Refugee family reunion is a complex area. The communities, the Syrian communities, or the refugee communities we worked with in the resettlement scheme before, was riddled with misinformation around what can be done to reunite people. And it created almost like a boiling pot of hope and desperation, to be honest with you, that was unrealistic. And the lesson we learned was that key, concise information around this manages expectations. And the second thing they'll need information and advice on is British citizenship, as well as access to social security, etc. Those are some of the key lessons we learned. The children, I don't have the answer on the bus passes or for the unaccompanied minors. Apologies.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Andy. And Pam's indicated that she doesn't have a question at this time, but might for the next panel. So thank you all so very much for your evidence this morning and the written evidence that you've submitted to us. And please do follow up on the points that we think that would be warranted. So I'm going to suspend briefly for up to 5 minutes so we can have a change of panel. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We will now continue to take evidence on refugees and asylum seekers. The format of the session will be the same as the previous panel. And I welcome our next panel who are joining us remotely. We've got Hassan Darasi from Challenging Violence Against Women, Project Manager of Community InfoSource. We have Phil Arnold, Head of Refugee Services, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, British Red Cross. We have Maggie Lennon, who's the Director of the Bridges Programme. And we have Pinar Askew, who's Human Rights and Advocacy Coordinator at the Maryhill Integration Network. And as in the first panel, I'm hopeful that you were all able to join and listen in on that. I will ask for succinct questions and answers because there's a lot of information that we're trying to gather this morning from yourselves, and there's a lot of interest from members here to be asking questions. So please do put an R in the chat function if you have something to add. Equally do remember that you can follow things up in writing if you feel there's something important that we as a committee need to hear. So again, I'm going to start the questions, and we have Jeremy Balfour who's going to come in first. Thank you.
And good morning to you, panel. Thank you for joining us this morning. Some of you may have heard the questions previously, and they will be, I think, certainly from my perspective, similar to the ones before. And so if I can pick up maybe the issue of the perhaps reliance of the Central Belt for people being accommodated, and does anyone have a view of whether that there should be distribution across the whole of Scotland, and if so, what are some of the challenges that we have in regard to that? And if you don't have anything particularly new to say, you can either just agree with the previous comments, but it would be interesting to know, particularly around services that individuals need, whether that's legal or in regard to health. Can that be provided, in your opinion, across Scotland, or is it better just to keep it within a small number of local authorities?
And who would you like to direct that to?
I'm open to suggestions if anyone wants to jump in.
Phil, perhaps?
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation to come to the committee as well. Yes, so the Red Cross is in support of dispersal across Scotland. I think it's hugely important, and especially when we're thinking around the role, what we're seeing in terms of the use of institutional accommodation increasingly across the UK. We feel it's completely contrary to areas of dignity and integration and areas of work that's happening in Scotland. I think, like the previous panel, there's loads of issues around how dispersal works in practice and thinking through what that means. Funding was obviously mentioned as one of them. There's other areas in terms of thinking around the specialist services that are going to be needed in those areas. Sometimes what we see is around gaps in thinking about vulnerability and some of the concerns inside that. Often, like has been mentioned, there was quite a conversation around data in the previous, last week. Part of the challenge around sort of disclosure and issues of trauma is that often these emerge over time. We also see gaps inside vulnerability assessments to make effective decisions around the support that's going to be needed around individuals. So the Red Cross has been sort of advocating around a vulnerability screening tool to be used more effectively to help think through what the wraparound services may be required inside some of that. However, so things around sort of legal provisions, things around access to health services and mental health services. There's some very specialist services around access, things like freedom from torture, for example. So those sort of broader wraparound services that are incredibly important. In terms of some of the vulnerability issues that emerge later on, we have sort of significant concerns over some of the issues around mental health and around the role of sort of more community-based, which other panel members will be able to speak to about as well. We've sort of released various different reports about, and it reflects on some of the comments that had come through previously around issues in asylum accommodation and the standards, around the length of the asylum determination process and other issues around that. In a recent report from Far From Home, the Red Cross has released information around about where we've got case files of 400 case files where we've got concerns of suicide ideation for people within asylum accommodation, and over just over a 12-month period. And often these situations are coming down to some of the complexity around support and making sure that services are trauma-informed. But that there is real space in thinking about how that works in a more effective way inside Scotland, inside that. The other issue I just wanted to flag is dispersal is one part of it and access to community accommodation. However, it's also important to think long term in terms of integration considerations. And one of the aspects after people get status is thinking through the family reunion and what happens in terms of integration of families on arrival. And the Red Cross has been sort of piloting a range of programmes across the UK that focus on family reunion integration, where there is key opportunities for acting more preventatively and opportunities for thinking through longer term integration for the family members. So I think it's really important just to think through not just the initial arrival of people in the asylum system, but also the longer term integration.
Thanks very much for that, Phil. And I know that Pinar and Maggie would like to come in. So Pinar, over to you first and then Maggie.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you to all the committee members for inviting me and fellow committee speakers as well. Just agreeing on a few points that Phil has also made as well. I think one of the key aspects for us is around the issue of and concerns around integration, especially when people are being dispersed into remote areas where there is no support structure in place. We have cases and we have people who have been calling us for support in terms of how do we set up groups, how do we provide the support to people, what support do people need. So we have been getting a lot of questions from some of the areas, especially at the moment with when the hotels are being used in some of the areas in Falkirk, Iskilbride, Perth and a few other cities as well. And we find this really concerning because there is no long-term structure in place, and we have people who are potentially going to stay there for a short period of time. And as Phil mentioned also, there's no proper structure in place where people are having access to services. And I think that's one of the key things, is having access to services and access to information, especially about their rights, especially about what support is in place. We have been having phone calls from some of the local areas, from the local groups who are trying to provide support, but they don't know how to provide the support, and they don't also have access to information in terms of how long people are going to be in the accommodations. And we were hugely saddened and disappointed to hear that Glasgow is no longer a dispersal city, and we believe that this is going to have a long-term impact on the work that we do and many other organisations within the sector who has been providing support within the city for many years. The concern about isolation and mental health is a huge one for us, especially when you have people who has not been properly assessed and properly directed to services, and you have them in accommodations, especially in hotels, for a period of time. We believe that this is going to have a long-term cause on individuals, long-term trauma, long-term mental health issues for people, and there are no services in place. Although we do hear that there are some services in place, however, in practice, we have phone calls and we have people who has no access to any sort of support mechanisms. Also, just to add on the previous comment, there was some questions around the Syrian resettlement programme. What we felt and what we think one of the key aspects, a learning point for us, was the around of using community-based structures and having programmes in place where people do have access to legal rights, do have access to justice, do have access to information. We believe that sort of programme helps people to integrate into community and learn about the local community that they will be calling home for the foreseen future. I think I'd like to end here. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Pinar. And over to yourself, Maggie.
Back to the original question, I think, in principle, yes, I would agree that wide dispersal could be a potentially very positive thing, not least because of what we've seen with the success of the Syrian resettlement. However, it absolutely must be in partnership with local authorities and the Scottish Government to really resist any further attempt to put asylum seekers in areas away from Central Belt, where they're living in hotels or institutionalised accommodation, for all the reasons that we've heard. I want to think about what happens after people get their status. In remote areas of Scotland and force them to stay there while they're asylum seekers, will they stay there when they want to get their status, or will there be a desire to drift back to the Central Belt? perhaps even other parts of the UK where there's a perception of more employment, and we have to consider the implications of that, people making themselves homeless, whatever. So I think a lot needs to be done to prepare the local authorities so that they can offer a permanent home to people. And there is some work being done on that at the moment. We're in negotiation with government colleagues on supporting a number of local authorities to do exactly that. And I think a lot has to be done on prepping local authorities. They are going to be taking large number of asylum seekers, very different from taking large numbers of Syrians in the public perception, where Syrians were seen as the good refugees. They were seeing what was happening in Syria, and there was an outpouring of generosity. And we know from Glasgow that is not always the case when asylum seekers, who tend to be demonised by the current hostile environment, are put in an area, and as we've been learning in the previous panel, exactly what's going to happen to that group of asylum seekers, refugees, once the new bill comes in. So it has to be very much with local authority approval, and the specific areas that concern me about dispersal away from main services is access to ESOL, English for speakers of other languages. That's critical and crucial, and frankly, a few hours of community ESOL a week doesn't cut it. Concern about access to legal advice, and concern about access to just general support and advice of becoming ready to be prepared to live and work in the UK if status given. The Scottish Government believe in integration from day one. That simply cannot happen if you have people alienated from the community in institutionalised accommodation. And I would also urge the committee to consider what's happened with the ESOL strategy in Scotland, which used to be a standalone strategy, which has now been subsumed into the adult learning strategy for Scotland, and as a result is not getting the support and the prominence that it needs. And there needs to be a much bigger investment in ESOL across Scotland, wherever asylum seekers are. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Maggie. We're now going to move on to questions surrounding no recourse to public funds. I have my colleague Pam Duncan-Glancy who wants to come in, then Miles Briggs after that, and we'll go to Emma Remote. So over to you, Pam. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the panel. Thank you for joining us and for the information you've given in advance, and also thank you for all the work that you've done, particularly during the pandemic, but before that as well. I know that the work you do is absolutely essential, and thank you. And can I just put on record my thanks to the previous panel as well? I had intended to say that first, but got straight into questions. I have a couple of questions around no recourse to public funds, and I'll try and group them all in the interest of time. I wonder if, Phil, you could maybe tell us a little bit about what you're seeing coming through in your Scottish Crisis Fund and how that fund can help reach people with no recourse to public funds, and how it could work perhaps with another more statutory offer for people with no recourse to public funds. Is there a mechanism, for example, to develop a bit of social security in Scotland that sat out with the list and the Home Office have? Also, could you maybe speak a little bit about the excellent peer support project as well that you launched last week, the How Will We Survive project, so that we can have an understanding of the benefits of the recommendations in that too? Thank you.
Phil?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Pam. And yeah, thanks for the questions. Yeah, on the Scottish Crisis Fund, there's part of the initial Ending Destitution Together strategy under some of the Action 1 as things start to get underway inside that strategy. Inside that, there's an initial pilot to try to provide an emergency cash grant to people at risk of homelessness, including people who are in RPF. It built off the back of work that the Red Cross was doing in distributing cash and enabling people to access this emergency cash. And it's a crisis grant that's funded by the Scottish Government that is in a pilot phase that's looking at providing support to 600 people. I think in terms of, from the comments from the previous panel around some of the complexities and some of the issues around data gaps inside NRPF, the ability to have data that's emerging from the use of emergency cash payments to understand the reasons why people are in those circumstances, who's in those circumstances, is absolutely critical. And by enabling access to cash for everybody, then it creates that sort of safety net where we can start to learn about some of the issues. It's a Scotland-wide crisis fund, and we're happy to sort of send some further details around how it's running, rather than sort of talking through all the detail now. But yeah, running across Scotland, it does include referrers who come from local authorities, for example, where and it creates the other thing is it creates a community of practice for bringing referrers together. Part of the questions around the complexity of no recourse to public funds and what we've heard in previous panels is around how does it work in terms of people's rights and entitlements and some of the complexities on NRPF. So through having a space where practitioners can come together, part of it is to understand how practitioners operate, the types of responses that are taking place inside that, but also around the circumstances of people's situations and how we can move to more preventative work rather than needing emergency cash provision. As a sort of reflection, as we've heard about some of the data, 600 grants is a very small tip of the iceberg in terms of the potential scale of need. And it is a pilot, but we would hope for the sort of long-term sort of support inside that to sort of continue that bedrock. What we've seen, there's other sort of grants in other devolved countries as well that do similar things, and we can see some of the impact of data coming through around how that can sort of help to plan services and think through the issues inside it. I would say it's only one tool in a wider range of interventions that are really required. Emergency cash is a starting point, and as the sort of work such as the Ending Destitution Together strategy sort of outlines, there's real need for independent advocacy, casework support, and far stronger considerations around mental health implications. And part of the issues around people who have got no recourse to public funds conditions is this confusion and separation from being able to access public services and other areas there. And so, which is partly how the report around how we will survive and working with peer educators and bringing lived experience is really important around creating a safe space for people to come together, around having a peer support space there, so that people can understand their rights and entitlements far better, that they're able to offer insights also around sort of co-producing policies and strategies and creating that space for lived experience to come through. Scotland's got a very strong starting point and other panel members will be able to speak about this, about how we create space for people with lived experience to talk about how the issues that they're experiencing. With inside the report, it was a peer research report with people who had experienced destitution. And it's just so key when we're thinking about how we design and develop services to make sure that people's lived experience is right at the heart of that planning. And so one of the areas that we had been calling for was further Scottish Government support for peer support programmes within inside Scotland to help create this stronger social connections for people.
Pam, do you have any further questions?
Thank you. I do, if it's okay.
Yep.
Thank you, Convener. And thank you very much for that, Phil. That's really helpful. Can I just move a bit on the kind of services approach and maybe ask Pinar to comment on the importance of local services like libraries, etc., in the absence sometimes of no recourse to public funds. And just to say, I think crisis funds and relying on money like that is not a long-term solution. I think we do need to look at a much more structural, systemic solution. But could you describe the role of services in the absence of public funds?
Pinar?
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the areas and one of the things that we have seen, especially during COVID-19, was the ongoing injustice and the ongoing issues that people seeking asylum and refuge has been facing. We've seen that the issue around digital inclusion, many of the people don't have access to Wi-Fi, and one of the key reasons is, again, not being able to work. So when people are seeking asylum, they are banned from working, and as a result of that, they are not able to provide themselves with the essential needs that we would potentially be seeing everybody else providing. We have people who are in the asylum process who cannot open bank accounts, which means that closes the door for potentially just a lot of resources. So not being able to have access to bank accounts, then this follows into not being able to have a Wi-Fi in the house and not being able to then join groups to participate. And that's one of the things that we have seen. What we very quickly did was we provided digital equipment and Wi-Fi for the people to participate in online groups, and then we were able to secure some devices from Connecting Scotland scheme, which was really helpful. However, we feel like this is not a solution for a long term. We need more structures in place. We need to talk about why asylum seekers cannot open bank accounts. What would it mean if they were able to open bank accounts? And obviously, the libraries being closed during the pandemic was a huge hit to the community. A lot of the service users we have go to the libraries to access to the internet, to access to computers, to print some of the maybe documents that needs to be given to the lawyers. And unfortunately, because we were closed as well, so it was a huge barrier for the people in that aspect. The other area that we have seen was the asylum support. It was quite disappointing and inhumane that the total amount of increased asylum support during the pandemic was 26 pence, and 26 pence is nothing. And I feel it's very dehumanising to even talk about giving people an increase of 26 pence to asylum support. And this automatically connected with issues around food insecurity, people not having access to food. And when we were referring people to food banks, I mean, the whole issue around food banks in itself is another topic, but the food that was not being there, the food which was not being taken into account into people's cultures, and the food that people would have in relation to that aspect. There are a lot of issues that people have been facing that was highlighted, I think, during COVID-19. And I think access to social places, access to services was a huge one, and as the previous speakers also mentioned about as well, the access to ESOL classes is a huge one that we are having. Having 2 hours a week is nothing. We have people who has been waiting in the queue for access to colleges for ESOL classes, and we ourselves cannot contact the colleges for ESOL provision to get a clear idea of when there might be places for people. So I can't even imagine people trying to have that information for themselves. And one of the key things that we've seen was the people within our groups, they were able to support themselves, they were sharing information amongst themselves, but we are really concerned for just moving forward how these provisions not being in place is going to impact on people. And in terms of, again, just going back to the dispersal and the local sport in the area, we are based in Maryhill, but we support the community wider in Glasgow. And what we've recently also learned is the houses, the flats in Maryhill is potentially going to be knocked down, and we are hugely concerned how this is going to impact on the asylum seekers who are also living in the flats in Wynford Road, which is just behind in Maryhill area. So we are really concerned, again, people are going to be dispersed into more remote areas where there is no support mechanisms in place. The other huge area that we are really concerned is we had incidents of people facing discrimination and racism. And when people are scared to report these incidents because of the fear that people have from the Home Office and the police as well. And then obviously these cases are not reported. And then when we look at statistics, then statistically we say that we don't have any issues around hate crime or incidents of racism. So this is, again, another area that we are trying to encourage our members to provide information about how to report. We are a third-party reporting place, so we potentially use that aspect of the work we do. But this is something within the asylum and refugee community that has not been even looked into. There was a case that when we were running an online meeting in our Min Voices group, and live on the call, we had a member who literally witnessed a hate crime when a group of people threw a stone in their window. And this was really shocking for us. And then the person just disconnected, and obviously we had to follow up later on. But these are just one case, and we're talking about many cases across the city that people don't know their rights, and people don't know how to report. I could go into talk about a lot of issues we have, but I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Pinar, for that, and that was a wee bit of powerful testimony there from yourself. I know that Hassan wants to come in on this point before I hand over to my colleague Miles Briggs. Hassan?
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity and for inviting me for this as well. Unfortunately, I missed a lot of the first panel, but I have been listening to what Phil, Pinar and Maggie were talking about. I do agree on the dispersal, that it's good to have a dispersal, but everything should be taken into account. And Maggie and Pinar has picked out on ESOL classes, which is the language barrier, where people should be well assessed and supported on that. The ESOL classes, actually we are having a problem with that because of the digital poverty, as well as there is any provision for people to join online, for example, the ESOL classes. We got some volunteers who are helpful and would like to go extra mile to help people in everything, but dealing with people due to the digital poverty, as well as there is no provision for support them, like giving them data to join the classes. This is another issue. The second thing, which was also talked about, was the bank account. Yes, the bank account, it has been a problem. Even if you want, for example, to give a provision to asylum seekers, first of all, the Home Office makes a restriction where you cannot send an amount to asylum seekers or to give them money. There are some families who have been allowed to open bank account, but this was not all the asylum seekers know about it, and there is no funding as well to cover everything. So this is the issue which it has been long and making the mental health impact on people, with the people that we work with. The project that I work with is the gender-based violence, or the violence against women in general, through working with men. But in connection, we do have work with women as well. So all the things, the impact that these things leave is very great. And the other issue was talked by Phil, which is no recourse public fund. Actually, these are categorized by three people, where there are people who have got status and they are no recourse public fund, people who have been refused and they have become no recourse public fund, and there are people who have been refused, but they are not known to the public, or they are not known, even the Home Office does not know where they were about. We only knew about these people during the pandemic. We were looking through them, so we call them hidden asylum seekers. These are not known, they are still in the asylum process, because their asylum process have been hidden for a long time, and these are the most vulnerable in the community. They were actually like taking part of that because they have been using friends and family members. The asylum seekers are only living on £5.36 per day, which is not enough. Even this is being shared with those people with no recourse to public fund. So no recourse public fund should be, I think, dealt with properly and appropriately. I know that the Scottish Government is doing its part on that, but I think a lot needs to be done on this, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Hassan. I'm going to bring in Miles Briggs and then Emma Roddick. Miles.
Thank you, convener. Good morning to the panel. Thanks for joining us. I wanted to carry on this theme of questioning and looking specifically at frameworks around this. So COSLA had issued a framework guidance on supporting people with no recourse to public funds during the pandemic, and that is currently being that guidance is currently being updated. So I wanted to ask the panel, looking at how that's been rolled out across local authorities, we have heard and had written evidence around inconsistencies. So I wondered, given your experience, where you've seen that. I'll maybe bring in Maggie, and then if anyone else wants to come in, can they put an R in the chat? Thanks.
Maggie?
Thank you. Yes, the discretionary element of the support that's been made available. The problem with discretionary funding is it's just that, it's discretionary, so there is no guarantee that it will be used in the way that it was perhaps intended, and that can be influenced by a huge number of issues. So we've seen particular problems in Glasgow and Edinburgh where the need is greatest. I think, without going into too much detail about COSLA's report, because I know that they've already given both written and verbal evidence on this, I think there's so much confusion around no recourse to public funds, not just in understanding what it covers, but I think with policymakers on what it means. And I think if we simplify it and simply make the case that no recourse to public funds is a public health matter, pure and simple, then that should give you a roadmap to know how to deal with it. And I think where there is massive confusion from local authorities and from the third sector is understanding how it is that Scottish welfare payments, which are devolved, and yet in terms of eligibility re-immigration, are still reserved. And this conflict is what's causing the problems. So there are some welfare payments and there are some payments which are not included. There are others which are. I couldn't tell you the list, frankly, and I've been working in this sector for 20 years. I think I know quite a lot of stuff. So there's a huge amount of work that the Scottish Government needs to do to make those things clear. And I would suggest respectfully that there's a lot of work the Scottish Government needs to do in order to try and draw these powers back and defend them. And if that can't be done, then mitigation along a public health line of thinking needs to be put in place that's not just discretionary and that is not continually putting money into fantastic pilots like Phil was talking about. But I would agree with the member who said that that kind of one-off sticking plaster approach is not sufficient. We do not know the number of people in Scotland who are covered by no recourse to public funds. I would agree with the speaker from the last panel that the figure of 9,000 is woefully inadequate. So I appreciate it's very difficult to plan a service when you don't know that. But frankly, we've never really known all the figures about everything to do with asylum and refugee figures in Britain for 20 years, and we've managed. So with a bit of goodwill, it can happen. But if you start thinking about it as a public health issue, then that might give you a way to think about how it needs to be addressed.
Thank you very much for that, Maggie.
Thank you for that. I'm not sure if anyone else wanted to come on in on that point. I wanted to move on to specifically look at models, though, which are in place to support unaccompanied children and young people, and what that looks like and how that sort of model potentially could be developed. So I wondered, maybe bringing in Phil on this, how that is very different and how services do engage directly with these young people as well, and where that could be maybe a model we could look at as a committee as well.
Phil?
Question. Yeah, so the British Red Cross has a youth service inside Glasgow that provides support for young people who are navigating through the asylum process and who are often within Scotland trying to access services and start life inside Scotland. But one of the key things that I would flag inside this is often whilst we're really in support of the guardianship service and I think it should be extended and expanded to age disputed young people as well. One of the considerations that we have when we're supporting young people is when people are in Scotland and have been assessed as being an adult, they are often going through quite a complex process of challenging their age, and obviously there's recognition inside the legislative changes around this to consider. What we see inside this is that obviously there's huge complexity of the age assessment process. And it needs to stay with specialist social workers who have the time to undertake those assessments. And there's also such a huge weight around people's age, and sometimes the process of going through an age assessment process itself can be quite traumatic. It can raise questions about people's identity to their family abroad at points in which young people are isolated. And when we see some of the impact of this, over the last few years, we've supported 3 dozen young people who have been going through the age, challenging their in terms of age dispute, and over half of them have had their stated age recognised. That takes significant periods of support. On average, we provide over 10 months of support for those young people, and during that period of time, they're living as in adult accommodation, facing various sort of safeguarding concerns and welfare concerns. And various other issues, and we feel like there's definitely space within inside Scotland to provide a more holistic service for young people within inside this context.
Thank you very much for that answer, Phil. If it's okay, Miles, I need to move on. Thank you.
Thanks.
I'll bring in Emma Roddick, who's joining us remotely, and then after Emma, Faisal has a quick question. Emma?
Thank you, Convener. This question is really for Phil, and it kind of follows on from my colleague Pam's questions earlier. In terms of distributing the crisis grant, have there been any lessons that you've learned that might be helpful to the Scottish Government or to local authorities when considering any future changes to the likes of the Welfare Fund to provide support for refugees and asylum seekers?
Thank you. What I'd say is it's very early stage, so we're only sort of 6 months in, and in terms of the level of distribution, there is around, we've provided support to over 300 people inside that context. So it's very early stages to sort of draw any conclusions inside it. I think there is definitely space for thinking through how some of the access to the Scottish Welfare Fund can cause issues, and so we've had in sort of inquiries about can we expand the fund to reach more people, for example, with particular groups of people who are struggling to access the Scottish Welfare Fund. Sometimes things like access through language issues and ability to apply for support with inside that. So there are insights, but it is anecdotal at this stage, and it really needs sort of a longer term picture to draw out some of the lessons inside that.
Thank you. Emma, do you have
That's
anything
great.
further?
Thank you.
Is that you, Emma?
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, just one more question. I've got for Hassan. In the previous session, we did speak an awful lot about the particular effect of NRPF on women. Are there other groups, particularly those who share protected characteristics, which are also disproportionately impacted by the policy?
Hassan?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I exclusively work with men, but we do have a partnership with organization who are working with women. By extension, through working with men, we do know that this has a great effect on the people that work with. As I said previously, this NRPF actually through the pandemic, we have known that there are people who have not been known they are NRPF, that they don't have no recourse parent fund, and the Home Office has forgotten about them altogether, and they are just living on the handouts of some charities and living with the asylum seekers as well, who are getting only 5.39 pounds per day. This has a great effect on the people, because if you don't have, it impacts on their mental health, first of all. The second thing is they have not developed themselves for the last few years that they have been on the asylum process. So if some of them are with families, which is also a big burden to them, and those who are singles are also having a greater impact on them. So NRPF for us, if we are going to take from the men's perspective, it has been impacting on the people, whether it is in their career or career development, as well as, there are some people who are on NRPF, but they have been having some qualifications back at home. They can't work because they don't have the status. Those people who have NRPF, but they can work, are far more better than those who are on the asylum process or who have been forgotten by the system altogether. So it is, it's a kind mixed thing where some of the NRPF people can be working because they have status, and those who don't have status, who have been struggling just living on the handouts of some charities.
Thank you very much for that, Hassan. Can I bring in Faisal Chowdhury? And I understand that Pam Gosal has a further question on NRPF after that. Faisal?
Thank you very much, Convener. After the powerful statement from Pinar, I just wanted to ask a small question. Given the squeeze on the local authorities, do you or the panel think that current third sector support is sustainable? As for Pinar or Hassan.
Pinar?
Yes, thank you. That's a really good point. And I think the sport and what is left for the third sector and the people on the ground is a lot. And we are facing that, and we are doing that on a daily basis. And we have been doing that for many years. And we have seen that during the pandemic, how the third sector and the local group ends up doing a lot of the work that the other areas, especially the local authorities, mayors, are supposed to be doing. And I think this has a huge impact, obviously, on the stretch of the organisations and how we continue providing the support. I'd just like to go back to say that we need to look at the root causes of these issues that we're talking about. Handing people vouchers, handing people travel expense is not a solution, is not a long-term solution. We need to talk about the root causes of these issues, such as not being able to work, especially for people seeking asylum, how dehumanising that is, how it stops for people to contribute to economy and fulfil their skills and to share their expertise. We need to look at the root causes of these, which is looking at the time for decision. We have members that we witness when we started working with them, when they arrived to the community very new, and 5 years, 6 years passes, and then we look at the same member and we look at the difference in them. We look at how they have changed and how they don't have any hope anymore, and the pressure that has on people, on their well-being, on their mental health. And we see that these people, and they don't want to do anything anymore. And we're seriously concerned about the welfare and the well-being of the people. Yes, the third sector does a lot. Yes, the local group and networks does a lot, but it shouldn't be us doing the work that the authorities should be doing, such as mayors, when we see that when people were in hotels, when people are dispersed into accommodations, we have cases where people's fridges are not working, where they end up where it's not being fixed for weeks, potentially for a month, and then where we step in and then we have to provide that support. It shouldn't be us providing the support. It should be the authorities and those who actually gets the fundings in places doing the work. And yeah, just going back to look at the root causes. And I think it's really important the Social Justice and Social Security Committee looks at the root causes and discusses what we can do in Scotland, what we can do within the powers that we have, especially around health, education and justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Pinar. I know that other people wanted to come in, but we are running really short on time, so I'm going to hand over to Pam Gosal to ask another question on no recourse to public funds. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. It has been reported that the discretionary grant matched the social isolation support grant made accessible to the people subject to NRPF. However, there was confusion and lack of awareness that this was available for those with NRPF. In light of this, what can be done to make people with NRPF aware of the support available to them? And I think my question would go to Pinar.
Pinar, over to yourself.
Thank you. Thank you. I think working with the organisations and groups who provide the direct support is really important, and making sure that we are aware of it, and also that the structure is in place for people to apply, and the structure is very clear. So the way that usually obviously we operate is we get the information and then we have a process of giving the information to the asylum community and the refugee community. So I think that information needs to be quite transparent, and the way that it's accessible needs to be very clear as well, and potentially produced in different languages, I would say. Some people's first language is obviously not English, so if that's the case, then we end up translating, or some of our staff speaks a few languages and we end up translating the document ourselves. So maybe having a more clear way of explaining the document, or having the processes in place would be quite useful, I would say. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much for that answer, Pinar. We're now going to move on to questions regarding the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme, and my colleague Natalie Dawn would like to come in. Natalie.
Thanks, Convener. And I just want to say a truly heartfelt thanks to the panel. Your comments and responses this morning have been very, very helpful. I just want to focus on the Afghan Citizen Resettlement Scheme. So the scheme itself has received some criticisms based on the limitations and eligibility, and the fact that the UK government are counting Afghan refugees that are currently in the UK within the total number. So I'm just wondering what your views are on the eligibility to the scheme, and if I could come to Pinar first, please.
I think in the previous panel, Graham has hugely commented on this, but I would like to say that it's extremely worrying to see the Prime Minister prioritising animals being taken out from Afghanistan than people themselves being taken out. And this is a huge concern. And when you look at the category and when you compare it with the Syrian resettlement programme, it's taking its time and it's not being done properly at the moment. And I think in Scotland, what the Scottish Government could do is to keep pushing and to keep saying that there are people that needs to be taken out as soon as possible, and then having the structures in place. I mean, I was really, really concerned and surprised to find out that the same hotels is being used to house the people from Afghanistan. And when we looked at the figure that Graham earlier mentioned, it doesn't make sense. It looks like a big business where the private sector is just benefiting from this, and the people are having no benefit from it. The organisations who are meant to be providing the support are not seeing any of the benefits in terms of information and in terms of having the structures in place. So it's extremely concerning about this. And what could be done more is we need to keep pushing to the UK government, and obviously the Scottish Government themselves needs to be keep pushing as well, and having the infrastructures in place, and not having hotel accommodation or having the hotel accommodation as a way of housing the people from Afghanistan, as well as people who are seeking asylum. And I really liked what Maggie mentioned earlier. It's that idea of a good refugee and a bad refugee. We need to see the people who are seeking asylum and refuge, not put the illegal label on them. And we need to create the structures where it's community-based. And we need to stop normalising the use of hotel accommodations as a place of initial dispersal process, or as a place of having asylum centres. And what we are witnessing in Scotland is exactly what's happening. The hotels is being normalised. And I think as the committee and in Scotland, we need to oppose this right now before any huge concerns happen. And we have seen what happened in Glasgow when we lost Adnan in the Macleay's Hotel and Bedford in the Parkin Hotel. So we need to immediately looked into the usage of the hotel accommodations widely. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Pinar. And Natalie, I know that Maggie would like to come in. Maggie?
Yes, just very briefly, it's very difficult for us to comment on the eligibility because we don't know what it is. There is no application process for this at all. Yeah. It's increasingly opaque. We understand that there will be a referral pathway to NGOs, but we don't know the details of that. And we know that the UNHCR are being asked to identify people. But there's a suggestion that some of the people they're identifying, people who are in Pakistan, not from the current period of flight, but from the one 10 years ago, and that seems unclear. And anecdotally, because that's really all we can go on at the moment from the people we support, we're hearing that Afghan families here can't find out exactly how to go about getting their families on the list, and the same in Pakistan, they're at a loss. So we don't know the system. I think it unlikely that it will be 20,000 in total over 5 years, because, as you've pointed out, they will increasingly count the people who came on the ARAP scheme. That's people who worked for the British government who are already here and are in the process of being resettled. So I think really what our focus needs to be on is what happens to them when they arrive in the UK, if they're put in bridging hotels in Scotland, how we ensure that people who are put in hotels in Scotland are able to stay in Scotland, where they will get a much better integration experience than elsewhere in the UK, and we know that because of all the work we've done in the past.
Thanks, Maggie. Natalie, do you have any further questions?
No further questions, Convener. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'm going to move on to questions from my colleague Marie McNair, who's going to ask some questions round about the Nationality and Borders Bill and the Legislative Consent Memorandum. Marie?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. This question is to Phil Arnold from the British Red Cross. In your written briefing, you state that if the bill becomes law, it will reduce access to asylum system, incentivise dangerous journeys, add to delays with the asylum system and reduce support available. Can you expand on these points for the committee? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and the Red Cross has also got some wider briefings that we'd be happy to send in afterwards as well for sort of further details about some of the issues. Yeah, the bill is the largest transformation that we're seeing of asylum policy, and there's so many different aspects inside it that will both distract, prevent people's ability to access both the UK and also the asylum determination system. And I think Graham earlier on had sort of outlined, and Andy as well had outlined, just the depth of the changes that are coming through. I guess just in terms of a few different reflections inside that, the impact inside Scotland around the grouping of refugees will have a significant impact in terms of people's ability on NRPF, around length of stay, around family reunion rights, around other aspects about how they go on to sort of longer term settlement routes, which will significantly impact destitution. It will have a very harmful impact on people's ability to integrate and to be inside the UK if they can get status. The one-stop approach inside the bill will fundamentally risks people's credibility, which is, and I think it was Andy who talked about the impact of disclosure and around how that doesn't necessarily come out at the earliest point. So we expect, so you've got issues around that, but also around things like the inadmissibility process about who can access the asylum system. What we'll see is a prolonged period of time in which people are struggling to access the determinations, which have a significant impact on mental health, on around access to services, on people's ability to integrate. It comes back a little bit when we're obviously not at this stage in terms of thinking through capacity, but in terms of capacity with inside voluntary sector, to be able to adapt to some of the changes that are taking place is going to be incredibly difficult. Often we're being called in to understand how the changes will impact different groups of people, to understand what their rights will be, to deal with the issues around destitution and humanitarian consequences. Is going to be incredibly difficult to mitigate any of that. I think in terms of the time, I'm happy to sort of follow up in terms of other areas of detail inside the bill.
Thank you very much. Marie, do you have any further questions?
Yes, I do. Thanks, Convener. To any of the panel who want to comment, and again, we're kind of pushed for time, but what is your knowledge of the provision of support for victims of human trafficking? And do you agree with the Scottish Government that consent should be withheld on this clause?
Is that to Phil?
Just anyone that can answer. Thanks, Convener.
I can't see any hands up because I'm just... Right, I've got Maggie. Maggie, thank you.
Short answer, yes, they must withhold consent on this, absolutely, as they should with anything that is crossing and cutting across involved. And my understanding is it cuts across entirely our own human trafficking legislation. and it's going to make it very difficult for Scottish courts to be able to identify who are victims of trafficking and then work out how the best way is to support them, because it's all been based on an immigration consensus, and that is clearly wrong. It's against the current human rights. Our briefing was specifically on the issues around human rights and how they affect asylum seekers and refugees, and the number of times that even within a Scotland which is committed to human rights, that is being undermined. And I think too often it's easy to hide behind the fact that things are reserved, to say that it's not our fault, we can't do anything about it, but I think where we can, we must. So I would absolutely support the LCM if passed by Parliament. I hope it is.
Much for that, Maggie.
Thank you, Convener. I have no further questions.
Thanks very much, Marie. I've got two final questions, and we are over time, but I think we need to hear them from Pam Duncan-Glancy and then from Jeremy Balfour. Pam?
Thank you, Convener, and I'll group as much as I can together. Firstly, the question I have is to Pinar from Maryhill Integration Network. Last week, Councillor Susan Aitken told the committee that there was no pause on dispersal and that it was a myth. But I'm conscious of what you've said in your submission and what you've told us today. So could you share your views on Glasgow's temporary pause on single male asylum seekers? And given that this group make up a majority of asylum seekers, the impact this will have? And then could possibly yourselves and the Red Cross comment on the use of hotels and whether or not you believe the Scottish Government could be doing something with the Home Office to look at reshaping how they use that 1.277 billion we heard about earlier to put people in better accommodation in Scotland, and what they could do as a proposal through local authorities on that. And very, very last, we've had a lot of constituents contact us to say that whilst the Scottish Government have said under 22s who are asylum seekers or refugees do have access to bus passes, the free bus system, we get a lot of constituents telling us that they can't access it. So could you tell us a little bit about why you think that might be, so that we can help address it? Thanks.
We've got a lot of questions in there, and what I would say is to the panel members that you can submit some stuff in writing, so try and keep your answers as brief as possible, please. And Pinar, thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you for those questions. I would like to read just a sentence from the news that was published by BBC that Susan Aitken had commented, that says that Councillor leader Susan Aitken told the BBC the ban would continue while the scheme was run on the cheap. So the evidence is there. I mean, it's in the news that was said that there is a ban on the Glasgow City Council being as a dispersal city. So I don't have anything else to comment, but to say that it's clear in the news as well. That could be searched up, and we are greatly concerned how this is going to impact on the work we do and for the future as well. In terms of the hotel accommodation and using accommodation, we have recently found out that one of the hotels that Adnan has sadly passed away is still being used in Glasgow, also accommodating single people and families with children. And this same hotel is where Adnan passed away, and in the same hotel, people are still being accommodated without any sort of support for the people, where again the local communities and sectors are being made to fulfill that area. There is a huge confusion for us, because whenever we go to the mayor says that it's not our responsibility, you need to contact Glasgow City Council. Whenever we go to Glasgow City Council, they say it's not our responsibility, you need to contact the Home Office. So there seems to be some sort of a triangle going around there where the ball is being passed from one person to another, which is extremely confusing for everybody. And we are talking about people's lives who are being placed in accommodations which is not in line with any sort of the aspects and legislations we have in Scotland. In terms of using hotels, once again, I would like to say that we should not normalise this. We should not be made to normalise the usage of hotel accommodation as part of the dispersal process. We say this from the very beginning, and we heard earlier, we believe that integration starts from day one within the communities, not in hotels across the country. And people should not be made to fulfil the obligations and fulfil the work of the authorities who are supposed to be doing this work. So we are hugely concerned about the usage of hotel accommodation and for the welfare that this is going to have on people. In terms, I could comment about this more, but maybe I should give some written evidence and testimonies later on. In terms of bus pass, thank you for raising this, Pam, because we actually had a few members this week saying that when they are trying to complete the application form, it asks for some form of ID, which is passport, and people obviously who are in the asylum process don't have that, and they have not been able to access the bus passes. We were going to raise this with our local MP, but I'm glad that the committee is also looking into this, because it's going to impact on a lot of the people that we work with. And just to finally highlight to say that we do not support the usage of hotel accommodations, and we think that it is going to have a huge impact on people while they're staying in hotels, and we should not be made to normalise this aspect. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Pinar. If anybody else would like to add anything to that, could you please submit it to us in writing in the interest of time? Thank you. And finally, Jeremy.
Thank you. And again, just in the interest of time, rather than getting a verbal update, it would be helpful if you have any information on this. A matter in regard to the Syrian refugees that came into the country. Just any lessons learned, both positively and negative, in regard to that one, and in particular, things that we can learn to do differently going forward. But perhaps we could do that in writing if you have information on that. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm seeing lots of nodding heads that we will get those answers in writing. And Hassan, thank you very much for the comment in the chat. We will take a note of that. So thank you very much to all of our witnesses this morning, and to Pam Gossel, who joined us from her other committee. That concludes the public part of this morning's meeting. At our next meeting on the 24th of February, we'll be taking evidence on kinship carers as part of our work to explore the breadth of the committee's remit and establish key priorities for this session. We're now going to move into private session to consider the remaining agenda items, and members should join us online via the link in your calendar for Teams. Thank you very much, everybody.